Some games require no introduction. Their legacy speaks for themselves. Quake, Super Mario Bros., Clay Fighter. If you like shooters and horror games, EA had you covered before the company's descent into monetized hell when they released the utter Gigachad that was Dead Space. When the original Dead Space launched in October 2008, it was a marvel of narrative, atmosphere, and gameplay. Sure, Resident Evil 4 had released several years prior, and much of Dead Space's presentation is clearly inspired by Capcom's survival horror classic, but no one had really seen sci-fi survival horror quite like Dead Space at the time. Take a chill pill, System Shock fans, barely anyone knows what that game is. Now, 15 years after the release of the first Dead Space game, the franchise is not nearly where many fans had hoped it would be. For quite some time, the series enjoyed sequels, spin-offs, and even cross-media projects like the animated film, Dead Space, Downfall, and Aftermath. But since 2013, Dead Space has largely been ignored. Thankfully, that ignoration is coming to an end. A complete, ground-up remake will hit store shelves on January 27th. Although it won't be the game many of us remember, the Star Wars Squadrons and Battlefront 2 developers Motive Studio is in charge of this one, and they are introducing plenty of new features and gameplay elements to differentiate their work from Visceral Games' magnum opus. From what has been shown, the Dead Space remake looks promising, but that's to be expected. The bones they had to work with were undeniably strong. The original Dead Space launched on PS3, Xbox 360, and PC, and each version of the game was favorably reviewed, receiving notable praise for its innovative gameplay and enemy designs, many of which are more than nightmare-inducing. While it was a critical darling, Dead Space was labeled a commercial disappointment by EA. In addition to Mirror's Edge, another fantastic game that failed to meet expectations, caused the company to lower its earnings expectations for that year due to missed sales projections. But like a corpse reanimating to become a necromorph, Dead Space didn't stay down. The Wii-focused light gun shooter-style Dead Space Extraction followed in 2009, and the puzzle game Dead Space Ignition released in 2010. We don't talk about Ignition, it's barely Dead Space, unless you think puzzles are scary, in which this one will make you soil yourself. Thankfully, Visceral Games used those intervening years to create an actual Dead Space sequel, and the work definitely paid off. Dead Space 2 released in 2011, and it was an all-around improvement, advancing and evolving the Dead Space formula in just about every way. Terrifying vision, necromorph babies, and awesome new upgradable suits? Hell yeah. Also, the first time you meet the Stalker necromorphs is peak Dead Space. Dead Space 2 reviewed even better than the first game, basically sold twice as much, and was still considered a commercial failure by its publisher. By that point, fans figured EA would never go back to the Dead Space well, but Dead Space 2 was so good that it seemed like an appropriate place to end the series. However, I guess EA wanted to make sure that Space was well and truly dead. So they made Dead Space 3. Released in 2013, Dead Space 3 changed just about everything that made fans fall in love with the series, and added microtransactions to boot. The claustrophobic horror trappings were thrown out in exchange for bombastic action set pieces, and that feeling of isolation was erased in favor of adding two-player co-op to the campaign. Talk about completely missing the point. This third game was developed by Visceral, just like the previous two, but the final product was far removed from the team's original vision. Publisher intervention and pressure led to the much-hated changes and additions, and they were so egregious that you have to wonder if they were intentional. Dead Space 3 proved to be the final nail in the coffin for the franchise for 10 years. Whether EA fundamentally misunderstood what made Dead Space great, or if they intentionally sank a killer series, the result was the loss of one of gaming's most promising franchises for many years. The Dead Space remake seems to be an attempt at a course correction, and we don't have long to wait to see how it turned out. Let's hope the reanimated Dead Space continues to take inspiration from Resident Evil, and we also get a remake of Dead Space 2. Oof, those stalkers, man. So what's your favorite space horror game? Besides the earlier script comment, mine is System Shock 2. Let us know in the comments, and stay tuned for our upcoming indie game spotlight on Tales: The Backbone Preludes. And while you're here, why don't you check out our story behind on Forspoken? I'm Mike Golczynski, and I'll see you in the next video.